My name is Joel Mabry. I'm with the State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. I wanted to welcome our audience in Muscat, Oman, and other parts of Oman to this Facebook Live episode of Human Rights Heroes series. Today we're going to be talking about a very important subject, and that's the subject of cooperation between government and civil society in combating human trafficking. I want to just take a moment to make sure that everybody understands what we mean by human trafficking. It's important, I think, that we understand this is a crime involving the exploitation of someone for the purposes of compelled labor or commercial sex through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. When a child is used to perform a commercial sex act, it is human trafficking whether or not there is force, fraud, or coercion. I think these are important things to agree on as we start this discussion. Another thing that the audience might hear is the use of terminology used interchangeably, human trafficking being one, trafficking in persons being another, and modern slavery. We use these interchangeably, and what we'd like for you to know is we use them as umbrella terms to cover both forced labor and sex trafficking. I think we can all agree that human trafficking is a complex crime. And we have two experts in this field today with us, and I'm going to introduce you to them in a moment. But the theme of this episode really is about the collaboration that exists between civil society and government. And in a moment, you're going to be hearing from our two guests, and I'm going to introduce them. And they will talk to you both about their experience and also pass on some hopefully useful information to you in Oman about how you might consider cooperation between government and civil society. So let me start with introductions. I have Tina Frundt, who is second farthest from me here. Tina Frundt is the founder of Courtney's House. It is a non-governmental organization here in Washington, D.C. And Courtney's House provides comprehensive trauma-informed care to trafficking victims. And Ms. Frundt is also a member of the United States Advisory Council on Human Trafficking, which comprises 9 survivors of human trafficking who advise the federal government on trafficking programs and anti-trafficking programs and anti-trafficking policies. Also with me today is Ms. Kenya Davis. Kenya is a federal prosecutor with the U.S. District Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia. Both Tina and Kenya are members of the D.C. Human Trafficking Task Force, and they work regularly together to ensure trafficking victims receive justice and the care they deserve. So we look forward to hearing from both of you, experts in this field. And I might start off by asking each of you how it is that you first met, and what was that initial interaction, how has that interaction grown over time?
We met, I am the co-chair of the Human Trafficking Task Force, and in that role, I got an opportunity to start meeting some of the members and players in DC. And Tina's name just kept coming up as a foremost expert in dealing with survivors of trafficking, especially children who'd been violated. And so I made it my business to try and meet her. And I think we met about 2 years ago, right at the beginning of my tenure as co-chair. And one of our interactions at the very beginning was I was doing a presentation on trafficking in a community setting. And Tina was there as a speaker as well. And after my initial talk, Tina pulled me aside and told me about some terms that I was using that were insensitive, terms that I was using that at the beginning of this fight against human trafficking may have been appropriate, but were no longer. And I think I, of course, was open to learning from her, and that's sort of been my posture with her throughout. Even though I'm the prosecutor and I go into court and I argue the case, I really look to her and people like her to inform my decisions about how to handle these cases, because they are very complex and they're not like any other cases that we handle in our office.
And I guess my relationship with Kenya really 2 years ago, but prior to 2 years ago, my relationship with the U.S. Attorney's Office actually started in 2004. when there was no human trafficking task force and people were still prosecuting even children and adults who were sex trafficked here in the city. And so during that time, it was very difficult, and even as a survivor, because people weren't really listening. However, in the very beginning, somehow we did convince the U.S. Attorney's Office along with D.C. Police to start the task force. And it was still extremely difficult changing mindsets in the very beginning and working with them for a number of years. So when Kenya came, it was so hard in the very beginning that all of our hard work paid off. And not only did it pay off, it got to a point where they understood trafficking, understood the terms, and was not about prosecution, and they were really about collaboration. And so I'm about trust. And I say that because the survivors trust you. So I have to trust the right people so that I'm not lying. What I say actually is going to happen every step of the way, including with the U.S. government as well. So having that partnership and seeing all of that really helped me continue to partner and work with them and see how much they really are trying to help survivors.
Our audience might like to know whether on the Washington scene, are you the only two people working on this issue, or are there dozens? What is the, give us a bit of a sense of the number of people who are committed to this, both on the government side, but also in civil society, just in the Washington metropolitan area?
Well, our task force consists of pretty much a representative from pretty much every law enforcement agency here. And so that goes from Secret Service to the State Department to Department of Labor Enforcement. We have at Main Justice, there is the Child Exploitation Unit that sends people to work with us. And so pretty much any agency in the city that touches this issue is a member of the task force. And then on the other side, we have, I think, nearly now about 50 non-governmental organizations that are also members of the task force. And so the task force is pretty big, and it keeps growing because there are more and more people that are interested in the issue. There's more funding that's coming for the issue. And we don't sort of turn away anyone. As long as it's a legitimate organization and they're doing the work, we invite them to be a part of the task force, because they may be meeting a survivor that we won't encounter otherwise.
Yeah, that's good to hear, particularly the part about funding. Would you agree that funding is where it needs to be, or could there be a lot more?
So as a nonprofit and a professional beggar for funding, I would definitely say there needs to be more long-term housing support for services and severe mental health, especially for youth transitioning out of foster care as well. So there's still some things that need to be advocated for it, but I will say that it's great to have so many people at the table. Also, it's great that everyone has their own niche on that, and can deliver services in a different way and also have the niche on that. And our kind of niche has grown to more extremely younger survivors, between the ages of more 11 to 17. We work with boys who are sex trafficked, which is different as well, and having parent support groups. So you need all of those. We have people that are already on staff to come immediately to the U.S. Attorney's Office, but then I can also do expert witness testimony. And I think that's great as a survivor of sex trafficking as well, and do an expert witness testimony for the survivors in your program. That really shows the truth and how you're going to follow them the whole step of the way.
Yeah. Another thing that I think it was you, Tina, who said, you gave a date, and I want to say it was 2004, and that tells me that what you are committed to doing is relatively recent, or am I wrong?
Yes, no, you're right.
I mean, what was going on in the 1980s? What was going on in the 1960s? Human trafficking has existed for more than just a decade or 20 years. What was going on in both civil society but also in government to address this issue, just for historical context?
Well, I think from the government perspective, we were still, although we were prosecuting sex offense cases in terms of forcible rape cases, our position for people who were engaged in commercial sex was that that person is a prostitute. And unfortunately, the government's position was that that's true if that person is 21 or if that person is 14. And so unfortunately, the laws back then, prior to the 2000s, were not the kind of laws that were in place to really put us in a position to see the victim in the case, the survivor in the case as such. We were looking at them as though they were another defendant involved in the enterprise. And so I think, there has been the JBTA, there's been Victims of Trafficking Acts, there have been local legislation that has been enacted to put us in a posture of really seeing and dealing with survivors of sex trafficking as victims and survivors as opposed to defendants. And I think that is probably the biggest change on the government side, because that also informs how our police officers interact with people on the street, how our social workers and child and family services agencies deal with this particular issue. It's a whole different approach than what probably was prevalent back in the 80s and 90s.
Well, yeah, I can definitely speak of what was happening during that time, because a survivor of sex trafficking and being trafficked at the age of 13, when I went for help when I was 15 years old, I was arrested and charged for prostitution and in juvenile detention for over a year. And what that taught me was that the trafficker was correct, because he said that he would not get in trouble and only I would. And so it kept that kind of secrecy of I'm wrong. And so what's changed during it, so I fought for change because of what happened to me and getting your records expunged when you were a minor, but placed in adult jail because of prostitution. So definitely that's what was going on beforehand. So it was a lot of work, and so that 2004 is important because I had to train police as a survivor for the first time ever, when they never considered anyone a victim, but knowingly knew that people had traffickers, and that part they knew, but they still didn't understand the controlling factor of it. So as a survivor, you have to not only go through what you went through, but you have to relive it daily to everyone and force them to believe that your story happened, but your story happened because you lived through it. So it's a hard process to convince someone. It was easier to convince people that it happened in another country than here. And everyone was like, no, you must have been in another country. That didn't happen here.
That's so important what you just said. I was wondering if it would be possible, obviously we're not going to name names and things like this, but could each of you give an example of how this process starts, that involves the interaction between government and civil service? So maybe perhaps, Tina, we could start with the victim perspective. When does the victim enter into, I'm going to use the term pipeline, but then maybe there's a better term, they come into contact with you. They've reached out to you, or you somehow have come into contact with this individual. You know that Kenya is standing by. You've cooperated. How does that work? How does that process work?
Well, first, backwards, right? I think people start with the services for the survivors, but I can't actually start services for survivors if I don't have a working relationship and the police really understand and actually call me in. So first you need to build relationships with the right police who will be there and are ready to listen. And that's kind of handpicked in the very beginning first, where I'm going to get a horrible outcome. So first you do that, so it will be a good outcome. And then people come to us a lot of different ways. Usually if they're from the U.S. Attorney's Office, then they actually refer them to us. So they make the phone call to us, but it can be in a number of different ways that I kind of love. I can actually be coming into the building, and this has happened, for someone else that I was referred for, another survivor of sex trafficking, but Kenya is with someone at that moment, and I'm kind of not a shy person. So I'm genuine all the time. So actually, I know who survivors are pretty well, and then I just because of knowing them, meaning I have never met them, but I can sense that they are a survivor. And then I start talking to them, and they say they like me, and she was getting ready to refer them, but hadn't yet. And then there may be some other people at the office. So that might be right away, or right before they go to something, or whatever service, or right when they recover them in the middle of the night. So maybe they're recovered at 4 or 5 in the morning, and they need someone to talk to, they want someone there. So also they call me in for that too. So they may call Courtney's house, we're there at 4 o'clock in the morning, we work with them on a service, and then we're there in the morning with them at the U.S. Attorney's Office.
And one of the other ways I think it happens is Tina's role is so important in that every survivor is not ready to come and talk to me. and report to the police.
Is it their intimidation?
Intimidation,
they
they may not be ready to come out of their situation. They may be very intimidated, not only by law enforcement, but by the trafficker, and not feel as though they can sort of break away yet. Oftentimes, the trafficker makes sure that every aspect of this person's life is controlled by them. Their housing, their food, their medicine, their access to their family, their phone and communication processes. And so they might not be, they may, have come to Courtney's house and talk to some of the other young ladies or young men that are there, but they may not be just ready yet. And when we really see the value of Courtney's house is when, over time, them having an opportunity to be in that sort of wholesome and welcoming environment gives them the confidence to say, I'm ready to report to the police.
But are you concerned about losing time? The information, valuable information may get
Yes.
lost with the passage of time? Is
I
that a
am.
concern for you as a prosecutor?
I am, always.
At the same time, you don't want to rush
Exactly.
the survivor into an uncomfortable situation.
Precisely, because we can lose them completely.
Tell us a little bit more about that
So,
process.
as a sex offense prosecutor, often when I'm not working these types of cases, I'm working violent sex offense cases where there may have been an assault on a person, and we get an immediate report. They report to the police, and then all the evidence is gathered during a sexual assault exam. The DNA, the clothing, all of that evidence sort of comes to us immediately. That's a very different case than a human trafficking case, because for a human trafficking case, we're gathering information about communication. We're gathering information about how someone may have been sold on Backpage.com and the records that come as a result of that. Emails that we subpoena from different computer companies. All of that has to be gathered. And you're right, the expediency is a concern, but the type of prosecutor who works these types of cases also understands that it's important to have the person in hand, the survivor in hand, in a whole fashion. Without that person, those records don't do me any good. And I'm not gonna have DNA anyway, right? Because these are reports that are happening way after the crimes have occurred. So it's just it's a very different type of case, and you have to work it differently, and you have to be patient. And you have to push when you need to, right, of course, but you also have to be confident that, this is something you can get done. And we have had great success with some of our cases where the abuse may have happened over the course of 2 years or 3 years, where we were able to go back and get the records. But the most important piece is that we had the victim there to tell us what had happened.
And I want to kind of piggyback on what she's saying, because they find them at today. Meaning today, she's 19, you found her today, and you found this one trafficker today. But when you wait and make sure they're in a good place, what I found out is they've been out in this life since they were 12. And it's been actually 23 different ones since then, and they named them all and said all the different states. So now it's a different kind of case. You thought you had this, but this actually is bigger, because we waited until they were comfortable and felt that you were telling the truth, so they knew they weren't in trouble, and they shared more.
Who else plays a role? Is it really just the two entities, Courtney's house and your office, or are there family members? Are there spiritual groups, faith organizations? Who else could play a positive role, or who has played a positive role in helping the survivor get to the point where they can help you in the work that both of you are trying to accomplish?
So at Courtney's house, we run a drop-in center, and every day of the week is a different theme. And then we have support groups, we call them one-on-ones instead of counseling, and we do fun field trips. That's really important because we create a family. And I'm saying that because we have over 200 volunteers. We have mentors if they need them. We connect them to other services that they may need as well. But they're always, and we're a long-term service, so even after a trial, we're still there. And so my point is, you have to have kind of long-term services to continue and help and to support. So your kind of referrals grow, right? Because at first, when they're in the very beginning, it is very rare to have survivors go, I like to go to church on Monday. It's honestly a very rare thing. That's something that goes, because we have to remember that people were forced to have sex with all different types of people that may have been ministers and pastors, and they saw men in a different light because they saw people who sold them. So it's a mindset to get to each level. So then your referrals grow and your network grows, because each level of trauma, then you're ready for something else.
And we have organizations throughout the city that provide different things.
Yes.
So, for instance, the Salvation Army has just recently opened another housing component that will cater specifically to trafficking victims. Often you can't drop a trafficking survivor in a regular shelter. The services may not be there to support them in the way that they need to be supported, and you may lose them. And so there are organizations like the Salvation Army, there are other organizations like Tina's that sort of serve a different niche. So there's Fair Girls, there's Her Resiliency Center. And then these particular survivors often have other things going on in their life. For instance, they may have a juvenile justice case that's happening at the same time because they run away from home, and so now they have a truancy case or something of the sort. So they've got attorneys that are connected to that. They have social workers that are connected to that particular case. And so we often are working with those people as well to provide comprehensive support for them. And you know, all of those people sit on the task force, right? And so they can give us a call and say, you know, here's what's going on. And I think it's a really important piece of it. Our law enforcement officers are specially trained. Our detectives, the FBI agents that work our cases, they've been doing this work for a long time, and they've dedicated themselves to this work. And so their approach to survivors is very different than someone who hasn't been trained.
Yeah, I think our audience is going to appreciate what you just said, Kenya, because you just defined the tremendous work that goes into creating this collaboration. You know, you need buy-in from multiple agencies. You need those agencies to have people who are well trained, so they know what to do, what to say at the right moment. It's not as easy as it sounds, perhaps, but it's going to take some time. So to our audience in Oman, we certainly want to help them understand too what will be involved. So if they don't already have the fundamentals of some of these structures, you know, what is it going to take to build up that type of cooperation that the two of you enjoy and all these different entities enjoy as part of a larger network? Is a civil society where it needs to be in terms of responsiveness, sensitivities, funding, all the different pieces that allow you to plug into this network? I mean, you are, clearly you've made that clear, but is there more work to be done in that area?
I think the work to be done and what we're currently also doing on the United States Advisory Council are the posters, right? We still see these posters that actually doesn't represent what survivors actually look like or not. We still see things on the ground. People are saying, please help me. And what happens is, the reality is most survivors are yelling, please help me. They're actually in fear and don't trust you. So it comes off of anger. So if we look at these posters and we go, that's what a survivor looks like. They're begging for help. They're looking scared. And that's what, and then we missed all the ones that don't look like we saw in the poster. And so the consistency of information still does have to be very clear, especially when it's U.S. citizens. What the population is, that is a majority of people of color that's actually being trafficked. Those do need to be awareness, because the groups pop up and then really don't realize what the population looks like. And so that means their programs are supposed to be competent. And so we're missing that gap still on that.
Yeah. Where is public awareness? I mean, obviously it's one of the pillars, right? You have to have public awareness. It gets to the prevention piece of trafficking in persons. Should it start in elementary school? Should it start in middle school? Where are we now with making people aware, particularly young people?
So I think in DC we're trying to change a lot of that. Have the posters different, but also in the areas that are actually a lot of certain areas in DC, a lot of children are actually being trafficked, and those materials aren't in those areas at all. So creating the right areas, creating things so people will know what happens to boys as well as girls who are sex trafficked as well. that is. However, I think you mentioned a very good point about what age do we actually start. And so for me, with working with the foster care system, it's actually really important to start at 5, 6, 3, 4. When we start with abuse, you don't go in and tell people about trafficking. That's not, because kids don't know that term. You have to make the connection of what they know. So we'll start with abuse and what abuse is and what control is. Just like we did good touch and bad touch. We need to start teaching them then what pimps are and traffickers are the same. We have to start teaching them that. And then as a survivor, I just want to end that note saying, I have 2 daughters, and because I had a fear of my children being trafficked, I raised them to know what traffickers look like. And so when my children got older, like 12 and 13, in middle school, they referred people to my program. And so that's the reality. And you know, we lived in about an hour and a half outside of DC in a very nice area where people would assume that things like that don't happen, but of course they did. And so I knew that. So I think it's important because then we will gear our children by the time they're teenagers. They'll be able to know what these people are saying to them online and not go.
Very good advice.
Some of the good things that we've seen in terms of sort of the general public's awareness, I travel sometimes and I go through airports and I see advertisements about human trafficking, what it looks like, what the sort of warning signs are, which I think is great because that means that the general public is being exposed to this topic. They're being made aware of it. There's also an organization, Truckers Against Trafficking, where they have advertisements up in trucking stations throughout the country where a lot of trafficking happens. But of course, there's always more that can be done. The State Department has done a great job. There's the Blue Campaign with the Department of Homeland Security. There are many organizations that are trying to raise that sort of public awareness so that people are just regular, everyday folk are tuned into what the warning signs are. And I think that's really good. And that's something that even our colleagues in Oman can start immediately. That's not something that requires this type of relationship to already be in place.
Well,
they can get it started though.
They can, and I think the best part of everything you just mentioned was that all of those posters had survivors at the table, helping them create. So survivors of human trafficking at the table. All the agencies that you mentioned also have survivors at the table creating those documents. So I say yes, you should definitely do that, but also engage the survivors to help with the messaging.
So that's a very important message. We only have a couple of minutes left in our program today. If you have maybe 30 seconds each, looking at your audience in Oman, what would that golden bit of advice be at this point in terms of the collaboration, cooperation piece?
Well, it might be tough in the very beginning, but I think it pays off to look. Here's the thing about doing the same thing every day and coming out with the same outcome. Every day you can do the same thing, but together doing something different will actually make the real change of what you're doing. And bringing survivors' voice in there together will help you just help so many more people.
And I'd say to my colleagues in law enforcement, we are always looking at ways to be more effective and more efficient in the resources that we use. And if we do not engage non-governmental organizations and survivors like Tina, we are shooting ourselves in the foot. And the traffickers will be so much farther ahead of us because our survivors know the traffickers and they're able to give us the tools that we need. And so we've got to have them at the table if we're going to be effective.
Super. Well, thank you both. Tina Frundt with Courtney's House here in Washington, D.C., Kenya Davis with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia. Thank you both, and thank you to our audience in Oman. We appreciate the time you've taken to listen and hopefully learn from these experiences. And thanks to other viewers as well. Please do follow the tip office on our Facebook and Twitter pages, which are referenced in the description in the video. Thank you again.
Thank you.